Jack Novak had only one rule when hauling cargo across the galaxy: never take shortcuts through uncharted space. It was a good rule. A sensible rule. The kind of rule that kept cargo pilots alive and employed. Today, Jack was breaking that rule. "Come on, you beautiful hunk of junk," he muttered, slapping the dashboard of his ship, the rusty nail. The vessel shuddered in response, its ancient engines coughing like an old man with a 3-pack-a-day habit. "Just a few more parsecs and we'll be back in friendly territory." The nail's navigation system beeped insistently, a flashing red warning that Jack had been ignoring for the past 20 minutes. He'd disabled the audio alerts after the first 5. Yes, I know we're in restricted space," Jack said to the empty cockpit. "But unless you can magically make these engines go faster, we're stuck here until—" A massive shadow fell across the viewport. Jack looked up, the sarcastic retort dying in his throat. "Well, shit." The ship above him was enormous, a gleaming monstrosity of precise angles and mathematical perfection. It hung in space like a geometric nightmare, bristling with what Jack could only assume were weapons designed specifically to ruin days like his. His comm system crackled to life. "Unidentified vessel. You have entered Vraxian Imperial space without proper authorization, documentation, or the requisite pre-approval forms. Prepare to be boarded according to Protocol 7 Delta 9, Subsection 12, Paragraph 4. Jack blinked. "Subsection 12? Is that the one where you let me go with a warning?" The voice on the other end didn't miss a beat. "Negative. That would be Protocol 7 Delta 9, Subsection 14, Paragraph 2, which only applies on alternating Tuesdays and requires a minimum of 3 authorized signatures." "Of course it does," Jack sighed, slouching in his pilot's chair. "And today is?" "Wednesday." "Perfect. Just perfect." Jack ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "Look, I'm just a cargo pilot who took a wrong turn. How about we pretend this never happened? I'll turn around, you'll go back to whatever it is you do when you're not terrifying lost pilots, and prepare for tractor beam engagement in 3, 2, 1. Jack felt the rusty nail lurch as the invisible beam locked onto his ship. The controls went dead beneath his fingers. "You know," he announced to the empty cockpit and whoever might be listening on the comm, "this is exactly why humans don't get invited to the cool space parties." As his ship was slowly pulled toward the massive Vraxian vessel, Jack had just enough time to grab his lucky jacket, a worn leather thing with more pockets than strictly necessary, and his universal translator. He patted the jacket's hidden compartments, making sure his emergency kit was still there. Lockpick, multi-tool, and a pack of chewing gum. Not much, but Jack had gotten out of worse situations with less. Probably. The rusty nail shuddered as it was deposited unceremoniously in what appeared to be a massive hangar bay. Jack peered out his viewport at the impossibly organized scene below. Aliens moved with precision that bordered on the creepy, each one following invisible lines on the floor, maintaining exactly the same distance from each other at all times. "All right, Novak," he muttered to himself. "Time to show these aliens that humanity isn't just a species, it's a state of mind." The airlock hissed open, and Jack took what might be his last breath of familiar air. Standing at the bottom of his ship's ramp was a welcoming committee of 6 Vraxians, each one looking like what would happen if you asked an accountant to design a reptile. "Human," announced the one in the center, its voice somehow conveying the capitalization. "You are now property of the Vraxian Empire until proper processing can determine your eventual disposition." Jack grinned his most charming grin. "Hi there, I'm Jack, and I'm nobody's property." The Vraxian's multiple eye ridges furrowed in perfect unison. Jack had a feeling this was going to be a very long day. 3 hours, 7 forms, and 23 stamps later, Jack was seriously considering whether prison might be preferable to Vraxian bureaucracy. "So let me get this straight," he said, leaning back in the uncomfortably rigid chair they'd provided. "I need to fill out Form 62B before you can process my Form 62A, but I can't get Form 62B until you process Form 62C, which requires an already processed Form 62A. The Vraxian processing officer, who had introduced himself with a name consisting of 16 consonants that Jack had immediately shortened to Bob in his head, blinked all four of his eyes in sequence. Correct. As stated in the Vraxian Code of Interspecies Detention Procedures, 4th revision, page 3942. Jack stared at the alien. You're messing with me, right? This is some kind of elaborate hazing ritual for first-time detainees. Bob's face remained completely impassive. Humor is inefficient, and therefore discouraged in processing Sector 7G. And of course it is. Jack sighed, slumping further in his chair. Look, can I just talk to whoever's in charge? Skip all this paperwork. The mere suggestion seemed to physically pain Bob, who reached for yet another form from a perfectly aligned stack. To request an audience with a superior officer, please complete Form 103D in triplicate, including all relevant appendices. The door to the processing room slid open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing what Jack assumed was a higher-ranking Vraxian. This one wore a uniform with more elaborate geometric patterns, and unlike the other Vraxians, moved with an air of authority that suggested an actual personality might be hiding somewhere beneath all that protocol. The processing officer ZXLTRP become a barked report. Bob or ZXLTRP apparently immediately straightened to attention. Commander Zrel, this human vessel violated spatial borders according to. Spare me the regulatory recitation, Commander Zrel interrupted, focusing all four eyes on Jack. Is this the specimen? Hey, Jack protested. I'm sitting right here, and specimen makes me sound like something you found growing in a petri dish. Commander Zrel regarded Jack with what might have been curiosity or indigestion. It was hard to tell with all those scales. You will address me as Commander or Sir. You will speak only when spoken to. You will comply with all regulations or face immediate. Yeah, Jack waved a hand dismissively. Face immediate consequences. Blah, blah, blah. Listen, Commander, I'm just a cargo pilot who took a wrong turn. If you'd just let me get back to my ship, I promise you'll never see me again. The silence that followed was so profound Jack could almost hear the collective clutching of non-existent pearls from every Vraxian in the room. Commander Zrel's scales darkened slightly, the Vraxian equivalent of turning purple with rage, Jack guessed. In my 40 cycles of service to the Empire, I have never encountered such blatant disregard for authority. Jack shrugged. First time for everything. The commander turned to Bob ZXLTRP. Processing officer, prepare the human for extended detainment. It seems we have a level 5 protocol situation. As Zrel stormed out, another Vraxian entered, pushing a cart loaded with technical equipment. This one was smaller than the others, with scales that seemed almost iridescent under the harsh lighting. Unlike the others, they moved with a slight bounce in their step that suggested a rebellious streak. Tech specialist Mika reporting for biometric cataloging. They announced, though Jack noticed their eyes darting around the room with unusual curiosity. While processing officer ZXLTRP was distracted with more paperwork, the tech specialist leaned closer to Jack. Is it true what they say? They whispered, voice barely audible, that humans can improvise. Jack raised an eyebrow. Improvise. Lady or whatever you are, improvisation is practically our species' middle name. Why? Ete. Mika's eyes widened slightly. Fascinating. The very concept is considered borderline criminal here. She pretended to adjust something on her cart. The commander has already scheduled your ship for dismantling. Standard procedure for all unauthorized vessels. What? Jack straightened. They can't do that. The rusty nail is all I have. They can and will, Mika replied, attaching some kind of scanning device to Jack's arm, in exactly 6 hours, according to the pre-approved schedule. Jack's mind raced. 6 hours to escape from an alien fortress, retrieve his ship, and somehow get away from the Vraxian Empire. It was impossible. Then again, impossible situations were kind of a human specialty. Say, Mika, Jack whispered, a slow grin spreading across his face. How do you feel about a little improvisation? Getting out of the detention cell was insultingly easy. The Vraxians, it seemed, had never encountered a species that would willingly cause themselves minor pain to achieve a goal. "Help," Jack called out. Lying on the floor of his cell, clutching his stomach, "I think I'm dying. It must be your atmosphere." The guard approached the energy barrier, its movements stiff and protocol perfect. Detainees are not scheduled for medical emergencies during shift rotation. Please reschedule your biological crisis for. Jack interrupted with a dramatic series of coughs. "Can't breathe, need form 62D. The mention of the form number caught the guard's attention. Form 62D. That is the emergency medical response authorization. How do you know about? Dying here, Jack wheezed, throwing in a convincing spasm for good measure. The guard's internal conflict was almost palpable. On one hand, a dying prisoner was definitely against regulations. On the other hand, the proper forms hadn't been submitted. "I will need to consult the procedural manual," the guard finally decided, lowering the energy barrier just enough to enter the cell. Which was exactly what Jack had been counting on. 3 minutes later, Jack was striding purposefully down a corridor wearing the guard's outer uniform garments over his own clothes. The poor Vraxian was tucked away in the cell, bound with strips torn from Jack's shirt and looking utterly bewildered at the concept of being tied up with fabric. "Human improvisation, buddy," Jack had told him cheerfully. "Nothing personal." Now came the tricky part, finding Mika, and then his ship in this labyrinth of identical corridors. According to their hasty plan, she should be waiting at junction C-47, whatever that meant. Jack rounded a corner and nearly collided with a group of Vraxian officers. He immediately straightened his posture, mimicking the rigid movements he'd observed. For a terrifying moment, he thought they would see through his disguise. The uniform was comically small on his human frame, but they merely nodded in perfect unison and continued on their way. "Adherence to protocol acknowledged, officer," one of them said as they passed. Jack waited until they were out of sight before allowing himself to breathe again. "These guys really need to discover the concept of security cameras," he muttered. He found junction C-47 by following the impossibly logical layout of the station. Each section was labeled with mathematical precision, making navigation almost too easy. Mika was waiting, just as promised, fiddling nervously with some kind of technical device. "You actually escaped," she whispered, sounding both impressed and terrified. "How?" "The cells are designed to be inescapable." Jack shrugged. "I asked nicely. Now, where's my ship?" Mika handed him a small rectangular device. "This is a station map. Your vessel is in Hangar 9, Section F, but it's heavily guarded. And let me guess," Jack interrupted, studying the map, "there's no way to get there without proper authorization." 17 different authorization checkpoints, Mika confirmed. Jack grinned. "Perfect." "Perfect?" Mika's scales flickered with confusion. "Did your translation matrix malfunction?" "No. But see, here's the thing about having 17 checkpoints," Jack pointed to a section of the map. "It means you've got 17 different chances for things to go wrong. And if there's one thing humans excel at, it's making things go wrong in just the right way." Their path to Hangar 9 took them through service corridors and maintenance shafts, avoiding the main thoroughfares whenever possible. At one security checkpoint, Jack simply walked up and handed the guard a blank datapad. "The commander's rel requires immediate processing of this priority authorization," he stated firmly. The guard stared at the blank screen. This is empty." Jack didn't miss a beat. "Of course it appears empty to you. It's classified level Omega-7. Only those with commander-level clearance can see the contents." The guard's scales paled slightly. But the protocol states." "Are you questioning a direct order from Commander Zrel?" Jack leaned in menacingly. "Perhaps you'd like to explain to him personally why his priority directive was delayed." The guard practically tripped over himself to let them through. Mika stared at Jack in awe. That was improvisation," Jack said with a wink, also known as making stuff up and saying it with confidence. As they moved deeper into the station, whispers began to follow them. Lower-ranked Vraxians would stop and stare as Jack passed, their perfectly synchronized movements faltering for perhaps the first time in their lives. "The chaos human," one whispered. "It walks without following the floor patterns." Another added in horrified fascination. "I heard it filled out a Form 27B without using a straight edge," a third confided. Jack grinned at Mika. "Looks like I'm becoming famous." Mika didn't seem amused. "Famous is dangerous. Commander Zrel will have noticed your escape by now." As if summoned by her words, alarms began to blare throughout the station. "Attention all personnel. Human specimen has escaped detention. Initiate Protocol 118 Delta. Capture and contain." The mechanical voice paused. "Additionally, anyone who has made contact with the human is to report for immediate decontamination and re-education." Mika's scales went almost white. "That includes me." Jack's grin faded. "Sorry about that. I didn't think." "No, you didn't," Mika snapped, then seemed surprised at her own outburst. "But strangely, I don't regret it. This is the most interesting thing that's happened in my 27 cycles of existence." They had reached the final corridor before Hangar 9. Through a viewport, Jack could see the rusty nails sitting forlornly amidst the gleaming Vraxian vessels. "Home sweet home," he murmured. "Now we just need to." "Halt, human." Jack and Mika turned slowly. At the end of the corridor stood Commander Zrel, flanked by at least a dozen guards, all holding what Jack really hoped weren't disintegration weapons. "Well," Jack said brightly, "fancy meeting you here." "Seize them." Commander Zrel barked, his scales flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. "And make sure the human doesn't touch anything else. It's already causing systems to malfunction throughout the station." Jack glanced at Mika. "Is he serious?" "Quite," she whispered back. "3 replication units have produced nothing but spherical food items since you arrived. The automated cleaning system is moving in circular patterns instead of the regulation grid formation. And the station's morning announcement played music for 7 seconds before the error was corrected." "Sounds like an improvement to me," Jack muttered, eyeing the approaching guards. They moved in perfect formation, each step precisely matched to their companions. Jack's eyes landed on a control panel nearby. "You know what your problem is, Commander?" he called out, casually stepping toward it. "You're all so obsessed with doing things the right way that you've forgotten there might be more than one solution to a problem." With that, he slammed his palm down on what he hoped was an important button. It was a gamble. Jack had no idea what the panel controlled. Luck, however, was apparently a human trait the Vraxians hadn't accounted for. The lights in the corridor dimmed to emergency levels, and a computerized voice announced, "Initiating quarterly emergency response drill. All personnel report to designated safety zones." The effect on the Vraxian guards was immediate and hilarious. Half of them turned and began marching toward what Jack assumed were the designated safety zones, while the others froze in place, clearly conflicted between their current orders and the emergency protocol. "Override." Zrel screamed, his voice cracking with frustration. "Override Protocol Sigma 7. But the damage was done. In the confusion, Jack grabbed Mika's arm and bolted down a side corridor. "You just initiated an emergency drill." Mika gasped as they ran. "Those only happen once every 97 days, at precisely 0900 hours, following proper authorization from 3 department heads." "You're welcome," Jack replied, consulting the map as they sprinted. "This way there's a maintenance passage that should take us right into the hangar." Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder. Commander Zrel had managed to organize at least some of his forces. Jack ducked into a narrow passageway, pulling Mika along. "In here." They squeezed through the maintenance tunnel, emerging onto a catwalk that overlooked Hangar 9. Below them, Vraxian technicians were swarming around the rusty nail, methodically preparing it for dismantling. "Oh no, they don't," Jack growled, eyes scanning the hangar for a way down. He spotted a cargo loading mechanism, essentially a glorified dumbwaiter that might work. "Is that safe?" Mika asked nervously as Jack began tinkering with the controls. Probably not, Jack admitted cheerfully, but neither is staying here. He gestured toward the door they'd just come through, where the sounds of pursuit were growing louder. With a reluctant nod, Mika stepped onto the platform beside Jack. He hit what appeared to be the down button, and they lurched downward at a stomach-churning speed. This exceeds the recommended velocity by at least 300%, Mika shrieked, clinging to Jack's arm. That's the problem with recommendations, Jack replied, bracing himself as they approached the bottom. They're just so limiting. They crashed onto the hangar floor with enough noise to draw the attention of every technician in the vicinity. Jack rolled to his feet, dragging Mika up beside him. Run, he yelled, making a beeline for the rusty nail. The Vraxian technicians reacted with admirable, if predictable, precision. They formed a perfect blockade between Jack and his ship, their tools held at regulation angles. Jack skidded to a halt, assessing the situation. Direct confrontation wasn't an option, there were too many of them, and despite their rigid adherence to protocol, the Vraxians were physically stronger than humans. Time for some more improvisation. Attention all personnel, Jack shouted in his best imitation of the station's announcement system. Emergency Protocol 999 Epsilon now in effect. This is not a drill. Evacuate Hangar 9 immediately. To his amazement and delight, several of the technicians immediately turned and marched toward the exits. The others hesitated, clearly uncertain. Protocol 999 Epsilon. Now, one of them asked. I'm not familiar with. It's new, Jack interrupted smoothly, just implemented last week. But sure, if you want to stay here while the atmosphere is vented into space, that's your choice. But did it? The remaining technicians broke formation and hurried toward the exits, their usual precision forgotten in their haste to escape. There's no such thing as Protocol 999 Epsilon, is there? Mika asked as they raced toward the rusty nail. Jack grinned. There is now. They were halfway to the ship when the hangar doors slid open, revealing Commander Zrel and a fresh squad of guards. Stop right there, human. Zrel bellowed, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. Jack didn't slow down. Sorry, Commander, can't stop, I'm late for an appointment with Freedom. Laser fire erupted around them, scorching the hangar floor. The Vraxians were shooting with mathematical precision, but also with mathematical predictability. Jack zigzagged randomly, making himself a harder target by simply being unpredictable. Almost there. He gasped. The rusty nail's airlock just meters away. A final burst of laser fire sizzled past his ear as Jack punched the emergency entry code into his ship's airlock. The door hissed open, and he shoved Mika inside before diving in after her. The airlock sealed behind them just as another volley of laser fire struck the hull. Get to the cockpit, Jack ordered, scrambling to his feet. I need to get the engines online before they lock us down. The interior of the rusty nail was a chaotic mess of makeshift repairs and personalized modifications, about as far from Vraxian precision as a ship could get. Mika stared around in wonder as they rushed to the cockpit. It's so disorganized, she whispered, sounding almost reverent. You say that like it's a good thing, Jack laughed, throwing himself into the pilot's seat and beginning the startup sequence. Outside, Commander Zrel was shouting orders, and the hangar bay doors were beginning to close. Hang on to something, Jack yelled, punching the ignition. The rusty nail's engines roared to life with their characteristic wheeze, and Jack gunned the thrusters without waiting for the recommended warm-up period. The ship lurched forward, scraping against the partially closed hangar doors as they squeezed through the narrowing gap. Metal screeched against metal, and warning lights flashed across the console. We're not going to make it, Mika cried. Oh, ye of little faith, Jack replied, pushing the engines beyond their safety limits. With a final grinding shriek, the rusty nail burst free of the hangar, tumbling into open space. Behind them, the Vraxian station was in visible disarray. Ships were launching without proper formation, communication channels were flooded with overlapping protocols, and the station's exterior lights were blinking in what appeared to be random patterns. In the chaos, Jack spotted at least 3 Vraxian pursuit vessels breaking away from the station, heading straight for them. "They're still coming," he muttered, hands flying over the controls. "Any ideas, Mika?" The Vraxian technician was staring out the viewport at her home station, her expression unreadable. "The central command module," she said finally. "If we could reach it, I think you might be able to help us both." Jack glanced at her, surprised. "You us both? You're coming with me?" Mika's scales shimmered with what might have been determination. "After participating in this much chaos, I don't think I have much choice." Besides, her mouth curved in what was almost a smile. "I think I might like improvisation." Jack grinned and spun the ship around, heading straight back toward the station and the approaching pursuit vessels. "Wait, what are you doing?" Mika gasped. "Improvising," Jack replied. "Hold on tight." The rusty nail weaved through the barrage of laser fire from the pursuit vessels with all the grace of a drunken bumblebee, which is to say, none whatsoever, but it somehow worked. Jack's piloting style was equal parts skill and sheer dumb luck, a combination that the mathematically precise Vraxian gunners couldn't seem to account for. "They're still calculating where I should be according to proper evasive maneuvers," Jack explained as he yanked the ship into an unnecessarily dramatic spiral. "But I have no idea what I'm doing, which is apparently my superpower." Mika clung to her seat, her scales oscillating between shades of green and white. "Is your species always this chaotic?" "Lady, I'm considered the sensible one among my friends," Jack replied, pulling the ship into a dive that sent them hurtling back toward the station. "Now, where's this central command module you mentioned?" Mika pointed to a dome-like structure at the top of the station. "There, that's the Admiral's command center. From there, we could potentially access the entire station's systems." Jack raised an eyebrow. "And why exactly would the Admiral let us do that?" "Oh, he wouldn't," Mika confirmed. "But at this point, I think surprising him with our presence would be chaotic enough to create an opportunity." Jack shot her an appreciative glance. "You're getting the hang of this human thinking, aren't you?" "It's terrifyingly liberating," she admitted. The rusty nail screamed toward the command dome, narrowly avoiding the station's automated defense systems. Jack spotted a small docking port meant for the Admiral's personal shuttle. "That's our way in," he decided, angling the ship toward it. "You can't dock there." Mika protested. "It's reserved exclusively for important people, which I've decided we are," Jack finished, ramming the rusty nail into the docking clamps with enough force to make the entire ship groan. The connection was far from regulation perfect, but it held. Atmosphere integrity at 82%. Jack read off the ship's console. "That'll have to do. Got a plan for when we get in there?" Mika blinked all 4 eyes in sequence. "I thought you'd have one." "Improvisation, remember?" Jack checked his pockets, making sure his emergency kit was still there. "We'll figure it out as we go." They made their way to the airlock and cycled through into the station. The corridor beyond was mercifully empty apparently. The Admiral's personal docking area wasn't staffed with guards on the assumption that no one would dare use it without authorization. Human audacity. 1. Vraxian protocol. 0. They hurried down the corridor, Mika leading the way through the labyrinthine passages. Twice they had to duck into alcoves to avoid patrols, Jack pulling Mika into impossibly small hiding spaces that weren't part of the station's official design. "These spaces shouldn't exist," she whispered during one such hiding moment. "They're inefficient." "Exactly why they're perfect hiding spots," Jack replied. "No Vraxian would think to look here." Finally, they reached a set of imposing doors marked with symbols that Jack's translator rendered as Admiral's command center, authorized personnel only. "Violators will be processed according to Protocol 12 Alpha 7. "Charming," Jack muttered. "Any ideas on getting through?" Mika studied the control panel beside the door. "We need an Admiral-level access code. Without it, the doors will remain sealed." Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out his multi-tool. "Or we could try this." Before Mika could protest, Jack had pried open the control panel and was examining the circuitry inside. "You know, for an advanced alien civilization, you guys really rely too much on basic binary systems. he commented, rerouting a few connections. It's all just ones and zeros in different clothing. The doors slid open with a reluctant hiss. That's not possible, Mika stammered. Remind me to introduce you to the concept of hacking sometime, Jack replied, stepping through the doorway. After you. The command center was a spacious, perfectly symmetrical room dominated by a central platform where a Vraxian with more elaborate uniform patterns than even Commander Zrel stood surrounded by holographic displays. Other Vraxians worked at stations arranged in concentric circles around the platform, each movement perfectly synchronized with their colleagues. Every single one of them turned to stare as Jack and Mika entered. "Hi there," Jack said, giving a little wave. "I hope we're not interrupting anything important." The elaborate Vraxian, presumably the Admiral, stared at Jack with all four eyes widened to their maximum extent. Security breach. The Admiral finally roared, his voice hitting a pitch Jack hadn't thought possible for Vraxian vocal cords. Intruder in the command center. "Actually, it's intruders, plural," Jack corrected, gesturing to Mika. "The grammar matters." The command center erupted into what passed for chaos among Vraxians, which meant they all began following emergency protocols simultaneously, resulting in several collisions as they attempted to maintain their perfect geometric formations in a space too crowded for it. Jack took advantage of the confusion to sprint toward the central platform, dodging the grasping hands of security personnel with moves that would make a professional dancer jealous. He vaulted onto the platform beside the Admiral, who backed away as if Jack were radioactive. "Don't come any closer, human," the Admiral warned, raising a small device that Jack really hoped wasn't a disintegration weapon. "You are disrupting the entire harmonic functioning of this station." "Yeah, about that," Jack replied, holding up his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of non-aggression. "That's kind of why I'm here." The doors slid open again, and Commander Zrel burst in, flanked by a squad of security officers. His scales were practically glowing with rage. "Admiral Vex," Zrel shouted. "The human has contaminated tech specialist Mika with its chaotic thought patterns. She must be quarantined immediately." Mika, who had managed to reach one of the control consoles, looked up in alarm. "Nobody's quarantining anybody," Jack declared, standing his ground despite being surrounded. "Look, I get it. Your whole society is built on order and precision. That's great, really. But there's a difference between order and rigidity. When things don't fit your perfect little boxes, your entire system falls apart. Our system has maintained peace and prosperity for 12,000 cycles," Admiral Vex replied coldly. "What can a chaos bringer like you possibly teach us?" Jack gestured around to the command center, where Vraxians were still colliding with each other as they attempted to follow conflicting protocols. Adaptation. Flexibility. The ability to handle the unexpected. You know what happens to species that can't adapt? They become perfectly preserved museum specimens, Mika chimed in from the console, earning herself a betrayed look from Commander Zrel. A sudden explosion rocked the station, nearly knocking Jack off his feet. Alarms began blaring throughout the command center. "What was that?" Admiral Vex demanded, turning to the nearest officer. "Sir, the pursuit vessels were following exact pursuit protocols and collided with each other while attempting to dock simultaneously." Jack winced. "Ouch, case in point." Another alarm joined the cacophony, this one higher pitched and more urgent. "Station stability compromised in sectors 7 through 12. An officer reported. "Cascade failure imminent if stabilization protocols cannot be implemented." "Implement them, then," Zrel barked. We can't, sir," the officer replied, scales paling. "The systems are not responding to standard commands." All eyes turned to Jack. "Don't look at me," he protested. "I'm just one human. I can't bring down your entire station just by existing." "Actually," Mika said quietly, "you kind of did. The systems are trying to compensate for all the protocol violations simultaneously. They're locked-in feedback loops." Admiral Vex's face hardened. "Then the solution is simple. Remove the source of the chaos." He raised his weapon, pointing it directly at Jack. Jack swallowed hard. This was not how he'd planned for his day to go. Wait. Before you disintegrate me or whatever, consider this: what happens the next time you encounter something unexpected? Because trust me, the universe is full of unexpected things. Humanity is just the beginning. The Admiral's finger hovered over the trigger. Your point, human. Jack took a deep breath. Let me help you. Let me show you how a little controlled chaos might just save your station. 62 standard minutes later, Jack stood in the command center surrounded by Vraxians who were attempting something entirely new to their species, winging it. No, not like that, he explained to a technician who was rigidly following Jack's improvised instructions with mathematical precision. The whole point is to adapt as you go. Try something, see if it works, adjust if it doesn't. But how will we know the optimal procedure without predetermined parameters? The technician asked, genuinely confused. That's the beauty of it, Jack replied. You won't. You'll figure it out as you go along. Trust your instincts. The Vraxian's facial tendrils twitched in what Jack had come to recognize as deep discomfort. Instincts are evolutionary artifacts designed for primitive survival scenarios. They are not reliable in complex technological operations. Jack sighed, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. The station's environmental systems were failing. Life support was down to backup power, and the collective's warships were less than 20 minutes away. Their only hope was reconfiguring the station's resonance field to disrupt the collective's navigation systems, something that had never been attempted before. Look, he said, placing a hand on the Vraxian's shoulder, feeling the subtle vibration of anxiety running through the alien's frame. Your species mastered quantum mathematics while humans were still figuring out the wheel. Your brains process information in ways I can't even comprehend. But sometimes the most elegant solution isn't the one you can calculate, it's the one you discover by taking a leap of faith. Chief Science Officer Zex La moved forward, iridescent scales reflecting the emergency lighting. Perhaps I understand what the human means, she said slowly. When I composed my thesis on comparative stellar evolution, there was a moment when the equations failed me. I felt a pattern. I pursued it without full logical justification. The result was the Zex La principle. Exactly. Jack exclaimed. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Around the command center, the Vraxians exchanged glances, their compound eyes blinking in rapid sequences, their version of a murmured conversation. We will attempt this, winging it, Zex La finally announced. Begin altering the resonance parameters. No predetermined sequence. Each technician will adjust based on observed effects. What followed was a chaotic symphony of activity. At first, the Vraxians moved hesitantly, each adjustment accompanied by vocal uncertainty. But gradually, something remarkable happened, and their movements became fluid, responsive. They called out observations rather than requesting instructions. When the primary resonance coil overloaded, 2 technicians immediately rerouted power through secondary systems without consulting the protocols. Jack watched in amazement as the station's massive energy web began pulsing with an irregular and unpredictable pattern, exactly what they needed to confuse the collective's targeting systems. It's working, he shouted as the sensors showed the approaching warships slowing, their formation breaking apart in confusion. Zex La's normally impassive face contorted into what might have been a smile. This improvisation, it is most efficient when efficiency cannot be calculated. It's a fascinating paradox. There, Jack grinned as relief flooded through him. Welcome to the messy, beautiful art of making it up as you go along. Outside the viewport, the collective ships began to retreat, unable to compensate for the wild fluctuations in the station's energy signature. The Vraxians had not only saved the station, they had discovered a new way of thinking. Perhaps, Zex La said thoughtfully, there are other human methodologies we should explore. This gut feeling you often reference, the concept of just vibing. These may have applications we have not considered. Jack laughed, the tension of the last hours finally breaking. I'd be happy to teach a masterclass. Lesson 1, sometimes the best plan is no plan at all. And for the first time in their 5,000-year recorded history, the Vraxians collectively decided to figure out what came next as they went along.